Good afternoon or good morning, good day, wherever you are in this world. We are welcoming you to our response seminar to disaster response. So it felt like for us responding to the big need in this country and in Syria. So we welcome you all. A few more people are still joining, but we'll get started. My name is Corinne Knipp. I'm one of the counselors here at Olive Tree Counseling Center. And I will be presenting together with Nick Stefan and Steve Scruggs, counselors and psychologists at Olive Tree. This is a time of great need, and I think how many people signed up for this reflects that the need is huge. Like there's no words to how people have been affected and will be affected in days, weeks, months, and years to come. So we really hope that with what we can share with you today, that will go out, have ripple effects of benefit and bring healing and help to people out there who really, really need it. And to some of you. We would like to start with a few polls, just so we get a feeling of where you're at, what experience you have with disaster relief. And so I'll share the first poll. So if you could quickly answer the question there. All right. Oh, still some answers coming in. All right, so the majority, about 75% do not have experience and 25% have experience. Thank you very much. I'll just bring up another poll. We're also interested in, have you been recently engaging and responding to a disaster or not? If you go ahead and answer that. This one is a little bit of a tighter race. Okay. Right now, 55% have responded to a disaster and 45 have not. Thank you very much for your participation. And then we got one more. We're just curious where in the world you are in right now. So we get a choice there. Thank you very much for responding to this one. And the vast majority is in Turkey, a few in North America, Europe, and the Middle East. Thank you very much. Those numbers tell us that there's a lot of people here who have firsthand seen the effects of the earthquakes, who've been there and helped. We want to say thank you to you guys. This may be a time where we get emotional. I can feel it because it's so hard to see what has happened. And if you sense yourself emotions coming as you listen to this. Yeah, just do whatever you need to take care of yourself, because that is emotional first help for us ourselves. All right. So before further ado, I'm going to hand over the word to Steve and let him get us started. And just on a side note, if you have any questions to material that we're presenting, please send them to me, and we'll have a question and answer time towards the end of it. So we want to gather your questions, we value them, so please send them to me. Thank you. Steve, it's over to you.
Thanks. Hey, I want to just echo what Corinne said about how much we appreciate your interest in this topic, your desire to help folks who've experienced a traumatic event. In this case, we're talking about a natural disaster, just an incredibly difficult and huge one. And also for those of you that are helping those folks, as well as the folks who are responding, and maybe your own impact from helping folks. So if you could look at the next slide, we'll be starting by talking about what trauma is. We usually think about two different types of trauma. Acute trauma, which is kind of like something that happens in a sudden and unexpected way. Obviously, one of the things that is different about an earthquake, for instance, than say a hurricane, is that a hurricane, you can usually see it a few days off and you have a little time to prepare, but an earthquake usually comes very suddenly, and that's really tough. Chronic trauma is when basically you have an ongoing traumatic event. And one of the things that's confusing about this is that sometimes it's just not all that clear. So for instance, with earthquakes, you could have aftershocks. So is that acute trauma or is that chronic trauma? And it's kind of one of those questions that's kind of tough to answer. And similarly with other types of disasters, you can have ongoing problems that are pretty traumatic. Next slide. So, one of the first questions, this may seem a little obvious, but why is trauma so tough for us psychologically? And, the most obvious and common sort of things, you think, well, if you get hurt or you see other people hurt or killed, then that's going to be pretty tough to deal with. But also things that have felt safe to us, like our homes, suddenly are no longer safe. That's going to be a huge impact. And then, the old Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you can't get the basic things you need, like food and warmth and shelter, you're going to be pretty upset. Our normal life rhythms are really important. And the impact of something that's sudden and unexpected can really affect our perception of the world. We feel out of control. And we can suddenly ask ourselves, like we might see ourselves as competent, but then we suddenly ask ourselves, am I competent? We might see ourselves as pretty calm and able to manage our emotions, but all of a sudden we might be questioning that. Can I manage it? And usually we get along pretty well with people, but all of a sudden we might have a hard time dealing with people just because of our own, the impact on us of the trauma itself. Next slide. Things that we found is our perception of the event affects our reaction. And go to the previous slide, please. And thanks. One more, one down. One of the things we found, for instance, if you go the other direction, now two.
Oh, it can.
Thanks. What we found is that actually people have less of a psychological impact for natural disasters. They've sometimes been called in the past, I don't think this is an accurate statement, but acts of God. But things that are outside of human control actually have a lower impact than human-caused disaster. And the old term is acts of man. We now use a more generic term, acts of humankind. But one of the things that's confusing about this as well is that it can't always be so clear. So for instance, people might think, well, nobody could control an earthquake. That's just a natural disaster that's outside of anyone's control. But when people see buildings collapse, that might trigger more like the reaction that goes with human-caused disasters. Say, well, if people had followed the building codes, then maybe my building wouldn't have collapsed and people wouldn't have been hurt or killed. Next slide. So one of the things I think that's helpful to think about is what's sort of the normal phases of disaster. And so what we typically see in the first week is what we call the heroic phase. And this is really no joke. People do amazing things in the face of a disaster. And that so-called fight or flight response causes people to do incredible things. People dig people out of buried buildings with their bare hands and just put themselves in dangerous situations and do amazing things. And that's really a wonderful thing. And fortunately, there's a follow-up phase called the honeymoon phase, and that's where people tend to pull together. Like, we're all going through this together. It's really rough, but we've got each other. We have this shared experience. You might almost think of it as a common enemy. And in that situation, people tend to work together well, get along together, and seem to do pretty well. That honeymoon phase can vary dramatically depending on the circumstances and the situation. But unfortunately, after that comes what's called the disillusionment phase. And oftentimes in that case, people start looking for someone to blame. They start getting frustrated maybe about the great effort that was made early on, but maybe that continued effort isn't quite the same. There's not as much support available, and then people start getting frustrated. And eventually, and again, this can vary wildly depending on the type of situation, the restoration phase. So for instance, an earthquake, oftentimes is limited in scope. This is a massive scope. So you would expect the disillusionment phase to be much longer in this situation. Whereas maybe a horrible incident, but that is much smaller in scope, say a tornado. With a tornado, that disillusionment phase may be much shorter because, like, for instance, things like electricity and water and phone service get back up pretty quickly. And therefore, people, aren't so frustrated because they have the things they want and need. I will just say, as mental health folks, we kind of think about what are our steps in these various phases. We're promoting psychological health. We're trying to prevent psychological problems. That's part of the role of this seminar today. We work on treating people and then, preparedness for the next one. And we're always thinking about the relief workers because those folks are just constantly exposed to traumatic situations, horrible things. Next slide. So what are some of the common stress reactions? I'm not going to go through this in detail. I'll just say that unfortunately, sometimes we have kind of that fight or flight response. We gear up, and things like difficulty resting, relaxing, or letting down can come along. Maybe we can't sleep too well, and we may use things like tobacco, alcohol, drugs, caffeine, those kind of things. And those things may not be helpful for us, but they sort of keep us going. And one of the things that I hear a lot from people who go through disasters or work as relief workers is sort of gallows humor. The humor starts getting really dark. And although that may be sort of like a common stress reaction, it's not particularly helpful. Next slide. So what are some of the psychological and emotional responses? Well, that invulnerability actually could be really helpful early on. It's probably not very helpful down the road. Saying I can work 24 hours a day might be great for a day, but if you try to do it day after day, it's going to spell trouble for you. Worry, of course, about safety, self or others. Sometimes people struggle with distressing or vivid dreams. And then one of the things that can happen along with just guilt is kind of survivor guilt. This idea that, why did I survive and other people didn't? Or why am I doing so much better than somebody who I can tell is, is a nice person or kind person or a good person, but they're struggling and they've lost so much. For relief workers, one of the challenges down at the bottom there, over-identification with survivors. If you get so identified with survivors, you get overwhelmed, you can no longer be helpful. Next slide. Physical reactions can vary wildly. from the ones kind of at the top of the list there, really most common, those fight or flight responses. One of the things that sometimes we have to remind people is just things like drink and make sure that you eat and things like that, because sometimes we're sort of so geared up, we don't think about the basics. GI problems are real common. One of the things I will mention is that there's a lot of research that shows now that when people are exposed to ongoing stressful situations, they have a decreased resistance to all kinds of illnesses, and there's a much more tendency for ongoing illnesses to flare up. What we always tell people is don't get confused by that old Freudian myth that this problem is, quote, all in your head. No, in fact, what happens is that when you're stressed, an underlying medical problem usually gets worse. So it's not all in your head. You're feeling real pain and real flare-ups of those problems. Next slide. Cognitive ones are, of course, very, very, very common. And I would just, we can't do a show of hands here, but if we could, I would say for those of you that's either been through a disaster or you've responded to a disaster, that second one, disorientation, is really common. Like you might wake up and you're not in a familiar place and you're kind of asking yourself, where am I? That's a really common reaction. One of the problems though is if you're not thinking clearly, you're not, setting priorities or making decisions well, but just because of the stress reaction of it, then unfortunately you might make poor decisions. And that can affect things like safety. And so one of the things we just kind of say to people is that it's good to slow down. It's good to stop and think. It's good to recognize that your thinking just can't be as clear in the midst of a crisis or a disaster as it is usually. Next slide. So what are some of the social ones? Well, sometimes people just don't get along so well when they're in the middle of a disaster. And so if people are impatient or disrespectful, if they criticize and blame a lot, if they have a hard time problem solving with others, that can be tough. Another option for people that sometimes happens is just withdrawing, isolating. And so people don't get the advantage or benefit of connecting with others in the midst of a difficult circumstance, which they could really benefit from. Next slide. So we're going to take a few minutes and talk about risk factors and protective factors. What are the things that make it more likely for people to have problems? And that first one is really important because it's really the most powerful one, high or repeated exposure. So if somebody is right in the middle of the worst of it, that person is more at risk. Lack of social support is probably obvious, but one of the things that's a big factor is, does a person quickly get to stability or do they have ongoing problems? So for instance, with a more narrow disaster, say a tornado, they might have a neighbor they can go and stay with, and they have some stability. But if you don't have a job, if you don't have any financial stability, if you're homeless, if you have ongoing relationship problems, then those are going to be big risk factors. And you can see there on the slide that you're more likely to have ongoing problems, whether that's you're an adult or a child. Now, some of these numbers that I have on here are a little bit different. And as we go through, you'll see some different numbers. That's because different studies, and even when they do a review of a lot of studies, one article I looked at 215 different studies. So you're going to see a lot of different results because there are different issues and different results from different types of disasters. But you can see that direct victims had a high rate of PTSD. And rescue workers had a relatively high rate too, 10 to 20%. And when they talk about the general population of 5 to 10%, it's a little bit hard sometimes to define that line between who's affected and who's not. So an example maybe with the Turkish earthquake right now is the people in Adana. There's a lot less destruction in Adana, but there are some downed buildings. And so some people might have a building fall down right across the street from them. They're not directly affected, right? But obviously that's pretty scary to have the building right across the street fall down. So that could have an impact on you. Next slide, please. Not surprisingly, poverty is a risk factor. And part of it is people with poverty just, they don't have much of a margin when things go wrong. There's not extra money available to just get them over the hump. And ironically, these next two sound almost contradictory, but that's what the research shows, little previous experience in coping. For instance, just to give you an example, I grew up with earthquakes. I grew up in California. And so I'm used to them. They don't bother me much. But I remember when I moved to the Midwest, I was frightened of tornadoes. It was only after I'd had, the experience of being around tornadoes that it didn't bother me as much. But if a person has had a life of stressful experiences, they're more at risk. Obviously, if a person has had psychological problems in the past, that's the case. One of the questions is, why do females tend to have more problems than males? And there's sort of two different theories out there. I don't know if they're accurate or not. One of them is that women tend to take more of a sense of responsibility for others, and so it affects them in a greater way. And one other theory is that women often just have more responsibility than others in the family. And that's why female gender is one. 40 to 60 doesn't look good for those of us that are kind of in middle age. I'm actually 65 now, so I'm actually in a lower risk group. But we think a lot of times people 40 to 60 often have responsibilities for others, maybe organizationally, family, and so on. But really, those over 65 only have a higher risk factor if they're sick, if they're poor, if they have to be relocated, or if they just can't, they're not mobile, they can't move. And you can imagine what it might be like to be in a wheelchair in a disaster zone. That's a really tough place to be. Next slide. Now, some cognitive risk factors have to do with kind of our baseline coping. So if we tend to ruminate, which basically means I just think over and over about stuff, I seem to chew on it and I bring it up again and chew on it some more, or we tend to blame ourselves. That's a risk factor, not surprisingly. But negative appraisals is kind of the idea that somehow I sort of see it as the worst case scenario. And so I'm always worried, like I'm the person who's worried about when's the next one going to be happening. That's a risk factor. Avoidance coping is kind of the idea that I avoid anything that tries to remind me of it. So I don't try to think about it. I try to push it out of my mind, and that's actually associated with more risk. And not surprisingly, negative religious appraisals. So if I see this as God's punishment, and if I even just have a strong tendency to assign blame, then those are all cognitive risk factors. And those are things that maybe when we think about prevention in the future, we can be thinking about those as well. Next slide, please. So personality risk factors, by the way, these tend to be personality factors that are quite stable. They sort of start early in our life and they sort of continue throughout our life. So these are ones that are really tough to change. But higher neuroticism, and that's just kind of that tendency to kind of feel emotions more strongly than other people, and that when you get stressed, it tends to affect your mood. Those folks are at higher risk for depression, not necessarily PTSD, but for depression. And then low extroversion. Just the fact that people who reach out to others tend to do better in the midst of the chaos of a disaster. Next slide. Social risks also matter, of course, and this kind of goes back to some of the things we talked about with family, but if you have ongoing stress and have to rebuild your life, I've heard something about like 100,000 people relocating to Antalya. Those folks are going to have a tough time. They have to find housing and a job, and it's going to be tough for them. And it's not like they can move home in a week or a month. It could be 2, 3, 4 years before the infrastructure and housing is adequate for the people that were living there before. And sadly, previous in-group, out-group divisions tend to reappear in the midst of a disaster. And sadly, even if they've been resolved in the past and they haven't really raised their ugly head, you might say, that in the midst of a disaster, that seems to come back. And part of that seems to be related to getting access to needed resources. Lack of social support, of course, is not surprisingly related to reverse recovery, but negative social support, and this is something where we can be particularly helpful. Because I think sometimes people want to, tell people to buck up and get your act together and come on, you got people depending on you. Unfortunately, those actually are not helpful. They've been associated with actually more risk down the road. So if people close to you minimize your needs, if they kind of expect you to just sort of snap your fingers and get over it, if they downplay how difficult this is for you, then that actually is correlated to post-traumatic stress. So we can be helpful by not using some of those old platitudes that are not helpful. Not surprisingly, being forced to move, or just communities that have low social cohesion. And unfortunately, that sometimes is the case when you have multi-ethnic communities. Next slide, please. So what are some of the family risk factors? The presence of children. And, this is a tough one because we think, it'll give you a purpose, a reason to live. But I remember in 1998, I was in Adana during an earthquake. And we happened to be in a little video game parlor. And I remember one of my sons kind of came running for me. And my other son just kept, like sitting there and playing the video game. And I remember putting my one son under a table and having to make the decision, do I leave him? He was real young, only 3 or 4. Do I leave him to go get my other son? And so oftentimes, parents are facing that no-win type of situation. If I take care of one, I might not be taking care of the other. Obviously, though, the other thing is that, the ongoing needs of children, as a parent, you always feel responsible for that, even if you're not in a very good position to provide for those needs. Not surprisingly, a severely distressed family member, is hard to deal with, and that often leads to interpersonal confrontations and lack of support. But all those things kind of related to what we talked about before. And what happens sometimes is you have different exposure levels among family members. So during that same earthquake, my wife was driving, and she thought there was something wrong with the car. So she wasn't thinking about the kids. So just the fact that I was responsible for the kids at that moment and my wife wasn't, that means we had different levels of exposure to stress and worry at that time. And then sadly, I've had clients who've been in the situation of that last point where a parent has actually said to a kid, I hate looking at you because every time I look at you, I think of the one who was lost. And so unfortunately, that may be that obvious, which we hope and pray that doesn't happen, but sometimes it does. But sometimes it's more subtle that just having that person around reminds them of what they've lost. Next slide, please. So thinking about rescue workers, and some of you have responded, we saw a good number had, and so one of the challenges, you're dealing with the same unpredictable and overwhelming situation, right? You're looking at all the disaster around you, and maybe you're having to deal with the aftershocks as well. And so not surprisingly, that can put you at risk for psychological issues. Interestingly enough, it's not just, like the people you might think of, like firefighters and police officers, but military, healthcare people, volunteers, all have been studied. And the most common negative outcomes, not surprisingly, acute stress disorder, you might say, is just like an acute stress reaction. And that's kind of what we think of when it happens immediately after a person's been exposed to a traumatic situation. And not everybody who is exposed to a traumatic situation, of course, has a negative outcome. Many do fine, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But not everybody also has post-traumatic stress disorder. Some people struggle with anxiety, some people struggle with depression, and other psychological disorders. So we sort of think of post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD as the thing that happens, but that's actually not the case. There can be a wide range of responses. And I think this is really important to understand. Unaffiliated volunteers are the most susceptible to negative psychological consequences. And that's really important because we found that to be true both in volunteers, but we've also found it to be true in the military and lots of other situations. If you don't have a team that you're a part of, people that you can sort of process what you're going through with, people that kind of have your back, then you're much more at risk. So we don't recommend people go kind of as the lone cowboy out there trying to take care of things. Now, one thing that's not in the literature, but just as I found working with disaster survivors, both rescue workers, well, in particular rescue workers, is unrealistic expectations of themselves. That somehow they think that they're going to swoop in and fix or solve everything. But disasters by their very nature are overwhelming. They're more than any one person can fix or solve. And oftentimes, despite our best efforts, we just can't fix or solve problems. So having realistic expectations can be really helpful. Next slide, please. Resilience factors are also really important. And the problem with these, of course, is that we're kind of in the process of learning how much these can be learned versus how much of these are sort of just part of who we are. And we have found that to some extent they can be learned, but some of us seem to just sort of come out of the womb with these, like we're just more optimistic and hopeful. And some people seem to be able to just kind of manage their emotions a little bit better. Some people seem to get along with people better. And some people just seem to have that sense of agency. Hey, if there's a problem, I can do something about it. And those things are things that, we are learning and getting better at teaching people to do those things. But I'd say we still have some work to do on that. Male gender, again, there's been a lot of questions about why men tend to do a little better than women. We talked about some of that before. Greater education levels. Maybe part of what that's about is having more realistic expectations too. And then older age. Ironically, over 65 folks seem to do really well. As long as they don't have a serious illness or mobility issues, they seem to cope. Maybe they just don't have much, pride at that point. They're just like willing to go with the flow. It's okay. I don't have anything to prove. Next slide, please. So what are some of the adaptive skills that are helpful? And one of the things that we found, the research is really clear, if we can reframe what's happened, in other words, if we can look at it differently, that can help. And one of the things that is really clear with change is if we see it as a challenge, we do better than if we see it as a threat. So one of the things we encourage people to do is when they face a difficulty, whether it's as a survivor or as a rescue worker, is kind of think of it as a challenge. Instead of being a threat, what's the challenge? How can you deal with this? And then the other one is maybe really obvious, victim versus survivor. And ironically, when we're treating folks, we oftentimes encourage them to think of themselves early on as victims, because if you're a victim, it's not your fault. But if you stay in that victim role, it's not helpful because you have no agency, right? You have no ability to do anything about it. So we do encourage people over time to transition to recognizing their role as a survivor. And part of that is recognizing the strengths that it's taken them to get through that difficult situation. People who do well in this type of high stress situation actually can use distraction when appropriate to reduce stress. In other words, they don't have to be on all the time. They don't feel guilty or bad about just saying, hey, I need to do something different for a while to get my mind off. And also to use their coping strategies in a flexible way. In other words, they don't have to just do one thing all the same way in order to be able to cope. And of course, if we can make meaning of a situation, that really matters. And frankly, what the research shows very clearly is that people who have a sense of meaning and purpose in the midst of a difficult situation just do a lot better than people who don't. And not surprisingly, the use of positive religious strategies. If they're thinking things like, hey, God's going to help me through this, or I know God's got things in control, versus God is punishing me, but not surprisingly, they do better. And then the capacity to seek support. I think in America, we have a tendency to be rugged individualists who think we need to handle it all on our own. And in fact, that's not the best way. The people that do best are people who can reach out and get support. Next slide, please. So what does that connected us all about? Well, one of the things that we found is that it just increases your opportunities or chance to find the things you need to get through a disaster. And so, you can see some examples there, but not only can you kind of like get things like where is the food and where is the healthcare, but, emotional understanding and acceptance. Just the fact that other people are going through this and we understand it, and even sharing traumatic experiences. Normalizing reactions, I can't sleep. Well, I can't either. Oh, good. I'm not going crazy. That's a really good thing to know. And mutual instructions about coping, like just kind of saying, well, hey, so-and-so suggested this and it's really helped. Oh, okay, I'm going to give that a try. And so those things really help people feel better and be less stressed. And not surprisingly, socially cohesive communities, and of course, well-resourced communities, you can't really do anything about the resource, but you might be able to do something about the social cohesion. They do better. And part of it is they recognize who has a need. They get the information and the help to the people who have the need, and they advocate for outside help. Next slide, please. So another question is, how long do reactions last? And what we found is that for most people, it's a very intense early reaction that just gets better over time. And in fact, we found it helpful to just give people that expectation that for most people, if you're really struggling, it's okay, it's normal, you'll get better. And acute stress reactions within the first few weeks, it shouldn't really be regarded as a problem. And I always use the example of grieving. We all know somebody who, in the midst of a loss of a loved one, somebody grieved really hard or really intensely. That doesn't mean they're going to have problems a month down the road or 3 months down the road. So the persistence and severity of reactions will really vary. Everyone's different. But I think it's really important to normalize those reactions, because if people have the perception that, hey, I'm broken or I'm messed up, then that actually is a risk factor. If they can kind of recognize, hey, this is normal, it really helps. So it's really important for us to pass that message on. Next slide, please. So one of the things people wonder about, what is the long-term outcome? So if you go through a disaster, what do I have to look forward to? And what we find is that for most people, they improve over time. And we call that natural recovery. Natural recovery is a good thing. And in fact, about 50% of survivors showed what researchers call resistance, that they really didn't exhibit that many symptoms. But ironically, what they're saying here is they never had more than 3 PTSD symptoms. So going back to the previous slide, those symptoms are normal. They're expected. And so if people kind of just recognize, hey, it's normal for me maybe to have sleep problems or me to be guarded or watchful or alert, those kind of things are normal, then it helps them to move forward. And we found a lot of people, 10 to a third, really have mild symptoms and they improve over time. And we call that resilience. They have that ability to bounce back. And there was a much smaller percentage of people that had severe symptoms. Now, one 10-year study did show that actually the percent of people with PTSD increased over time. And the only reason why I mention that is what we found is that if people continue to have symptoms after about 6 months, significant symptoms, then we found that really there's not much potential for improvement without treatment. So one of the things we say to people is, hey, if you're really struggling 6 months out, probably it's a good time to start seeking treatment. Look for a counselor to meet with. Next slide. Excuse me. So here's just a little bit more detail. Another, again, looking at different studies, but survivors who develop chronic long-term problems is usually less than 10%. And again, part of this varies depending on the severity of the trauma. But moderate effects for even people who have moderate effects usually don't have enduring problems. And so these severe or very severe effects were probably for, honestly, the ones that are above 10% are for people who have the most severe trauma. Unfortunately, with a very wide-scale traumatic event like the Turkish earthquake, Syrian earthquake, is unfortunately, there's probably going to be a higher percent just because it was so devastating and so many things were lost. People, places, almost whole cities. Next slide. So what are the most common problems? Well, I'll just give you a very brief definition of PTSD. Post-traumatic stress disorder is basically where you have a cluster of symptoms that just don't seem to go away. And the first one is kind of what we call intrusive recollections. You just kind of keep having reminders, and that can take the form of thoughts, memories, mental images, distressing dreams. And then what happens is people often try to avoid things that remind them of it. And then they tend to shut down their emotions or get overwhelmed by their emotions. And then finally, behaviorally, they oftentimes have trouble relaxing. And so they startle easily and they just feel watchful and guarded all the time. And so if a person has that cluster of symptoms and they persist over time, we call that post-traumatic stress disorder. Depression is something we probably all have experienced. And so we all feel down at times. And obviously things like grief or loss of someone close to you is really common, but maybe some of the more subtle signs of depression, besides just feeling down, is things like low energy, low motivation, just kind of feeling like guilty, and that guilt just sort of hangs on. And so when a person has, trouble concentrating and focusing, sometimes that's a sign of depression. And then not surprisingly, self-blame, guilt, and shame, kind of think of it like this. Our minds are set up to try to attribute meaning to an event. And when there's an event that happens that we just can't figure out, for instance, the scale of this earthquake is just so great, we just have a hard time figuring it out. Think about who the most convenient target is. And it's usually ourselves. And so a lot of times people blame themselves. And this kind of goes back to also unrealistic expectations that somehow I should have done more or done something better. And sometimes, of course, it has to do with survivor guilt, that somehow I survived when others didn't. And it just doesn't seem fair. Next slide. And then it's really common. And as we're preparing, I started thinking about the fact that some cultures and society talking about suicide is kind of taboo. But unfortunately, it does exist in all societies. So just kind of keep in mind that is a reality. And the other thing is that sometimes people are afraid to talk about suicide or ask other people about suicide for fear that it will put the idea in their head and make it more likely for them to commit suicide. Actually, the research shows exactly the opposite. Belief, and it puts someone to talk to help. Unfortunately, anger and aggressive behavior is a real common response, and honestly, more often with men than women. And part of it is when we feel helpless and out of control, we like to do things to reassert a sense of control. And so acting out aggressively can kind of make us feel better. Unfortunately, it doesn't make things better. And so being angry and aggressive, causes us to be more distant from the people around us. And of course, it can make the situation worse. Things like injury and legal problems. And then alcohol and drug abuse are typically a form of self-medication. They're easily accessible, especially alcohol, and convenient. And in the short term, it seems like a really good idea. I have a hard time sleeping. I get a few beers or a few drinks in me and I sleep a little bit better. It sounds great. The problem is in the long term, alcohol actually disrupts your sleep and you need more and more to get the same effect. And so unfortunately, we just find a lot of people fall into that trap, but it really is a trap, because although it seems like a quick fix, in the end, it actually makes things worse. Well, I think now is when I'm turning it over to my colleague, Nick.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, I appreciate it. As you point out, it can be very easy to fall into these traps, find ourselves getting stuck in the needs of others, in our own needs. And I think for many people in the wake of natural disasters, it feels all too natural to get lost in the middle of that. And so it can leave us feeling a bit hopeless, like we don't know where to go next. And so I hoped we could take the wisdom of Steve's presentation and kind of focus it down into some areas, some very practical ways that we can move forward. One of the best ways to give a sense of hope is to remind people that their actions matter, that they can do things that matter. And so in going forward, into this all too practical question of what do we do? I am really going to kind of focus on two large themes that run throughout. One, people in the wake of natural disasters, people do much better when they have stable, trustworthy social support system. When they have other people who can gather around them, people they can go to when they need something. And the second theme I'd like you to just keep in mind is that of self-efficacy, the belief that we can actually do something that matters, that in those moments we can get lost in a sense of hopelessness, that this is the way it is. We just have to grit and bear it and suffer. And a lot of these expectations get in the way of us recognizing that we still can do things. We might not be able to do everything, but we can do things, and those matter. So I'd like to start off with the next slide, which is about prioritizing priorities, about putting the first things first. One way of trying to do this was introduced in a graphic that many of you have probably seen before, referred to as Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Essentially, it is just a way to try to visualize what are the basic priorities, the basic needs of life. And given that, where are the places that we can intervene and be the most effective? There are many important things in life. You know, if we're interacting with someone who is struggling at work, we want to help them at work. But if we find out that they're struggling at work because they lost their home and they don't have a safe place to be at night, well, then we really need to intervene there first. We need to provide them with what they need to be safe. And of course, even more basic than that are the essential physiological needs. In a crisis like this, these lower level needs, these foundational needs need to be prioritized. And to that degree that there are going to be all kinds of agencies and groups coming in to help with just that. Try to work with the groups that are there to make sure that the priorities are prioritized, that we put the first things first. And so I'd like to move ahead to what comes next, right? How do we go about doing this for people? And the one term that's often been used in the mental health field in the United States is psychological first aid. What are the basic things we can do to provide people with a sense of safety, connecting them to others, to keep them, or to give them a sense of hope and a sense of calm? We want them to be able to have access to social, physical, and emotional support, and to be able to feel they're able to help themselves. And so this is actually on the next slide. My apologies for it. But these three big themes are going to be things we're going to be focusing in on. How do we provide that? What does it look like practically? So there, we have a nice acronym, or just the 3 L's that give us a place to start with this on the next slide. We can boil psychological first aid to being able to look, listen, and link. Looking has everything to do with being aware of the context, be aware of what the actual needs are. Often we can come into disaster scenarios and think that we're just going to see what's needed. While that's possible, we might not. It's necessary that we are able to come in with a learning spirit, a readiness to ask people what's needed and to take their opinion seriously, to look at the other organizations that are present and try to coordinate them best that we can. So first off, make sure that you're learning about what happened. Who are the people on the ground who are helping? How can you work with them? And what resources are they making available? This is a vital part of the process so that later on, you don't necessarily get tunnel vision in your own expectations of how you can help, of how you can provide care for people. Secondarily, being able to assess needs and concerns. It just is a fancy way of saying, think a little bit about what their actual needs are and be ready to respond in kind. So after we've looked, after we've tried to open ourselves to what's there, try to listen. Try to be able to provide an open ear towards people on the ground. They need comfort. Yes, they also need people who are going to help them manage their emotions to support those healthy coping mechanisms that Steve talked about earlier. In trying to listen to them, try to give them room to recognize they themselves are trying to make sense of what's going on there. In many ways, one of the beautiful things as Christians is that we know that wherever we go, God is always already at work. But that means that we can go in humbly and wait for him to be present. We have a role here, and being able to come in with a godly voice means giving the other person room to share that voice as well. The third item is what we call linking. So protecting people, making sure that we can get their basic needs met. You know, some are going to need clean drinking water and food. For that might be the priority. For others, it might be housing. For others, it might be information, trying to figure out what happened to their family, to their friends, to their community. There's a lot of confusion and uncertainty. This is one of the reasons why that look category comes first. We need to go out of our way to educate ourselves as we walk into this, recognizing that we are not going to come in and fix everyone's needs. That's okay, that's necessary. Look for ways to provide practical care and support. Don't intrude into their world. And if at all possible, look for ways to show them how they themselves can take action to get their needs met. They are, as Steve rightly pointed out, they are not victims. They are not powerless in this situation. They do have some measure of agency. And the more that we can support that, the more hope that they will feel in that experience. Look for ways to connect people to the information, to the services, to their own social supports that are on the ground. This might be their own local communities that are in need. But either way, remember that we are trying to work part of a much larger network of resources that are out there. And we're really looking for ways to coordinate with that in the most effective way possible. On the next slide, I want to draw attention to people who might need extra support, for whom they might be more vulnerable in a number of ways. For example, children, especially those who are separated from their caregivers, are all too vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. They are in a very vulnerable position. So looking at them and recognizing they need to be connected to more institutional or stronger social supports that can provide them with the ongoing care they need is vital. Additionally, with people with with significant health conditions or disabilities, they will also need additional care and support that goes beyond what you will be able to provide immediately. The same thing with people who are at risk of discrimination or violence. And I would include in this territory someone who is experiencing suicidal thoughts or feelings or interacting with someone who is. These are people who are falling into some of those risk categories that Steve talked about earlier. And it's vital that we look for ways to connect them to the emergency resources on the ground who can provide a more stable place for them in an ongoing way. Be aware of and curious about those who might be overwhelmed with caregiving roles. One of the items that Steve drew attention to was that women often fall into this more vulnerable population, not least because they are carrying a lot of these caregiving roles. And the world is much more chaotic in the wake of this kind of disaster. Be on the lookout for those who have other risk factors. For example, perhaps people with a history of depression. We know that this kind of disaster can inflame and exacerbate depressive symptoms. And so if you know someone who's already vulnerable to that, who's experienced that in the past, just check in with them and see if there's some other layer of support that could be valuable for them. So on the next slide, I continue on with a few other examples, including people with serious life-threatening injuries who are going to need emergency medical care, people who are so upset that they cannot take care of themselves, people who may hurt themselves or others. And the last item I think is just my trying to put a pin and summarize this idea that we need to respect the role that we're there in. We are not going to be the answer to everyone's needs. There are going to be so many needs that appear overwhelming at the time. We are not going to fix it ourselves. Respect your role. Recognize that part of us being here is to connect them to their best resources they have available. And we can be the most effective when we work together as a community to recognize that we are not on our own. So once we recognize this, we can move on to listen, the next section. In this, we want to make sure we respect their privacy. People are hurt. They are in terribly vulnerable positions. Their stories, their experiences are not ours to exploit. Especially as counselors, we are well aware that when people share information with us within the bounds of a counseling relationship, that need to keep that private is vital. That is their story, not ours. And we want to respect it as such. I suggest providing a more godly voice can help others reframe. And what I really mean by this is that often when we come to people with who are in vulnerable positions, they might experience a lot of self-criticism, self-blame. They might be all too aware of areas where they fell short, or all too quick to want to blame someone else. Coming with a godly voice means being open to what's honestly there. And that can help us reframe things in a more positive way if we're willing to do so, if we're willing to bring that voice of compassion, of love, of gentleness to the people we interact with. They're living in an overwhelming context. Provide what care we can. And to that degree, try to do so in a calm manner. Don't support criticism. Don't give them quick solutions. Don't minimize their pain by diminishing it or comparing it with others who might be doing better or yours. This is not a time to compare and thus bring attention off of where they're at. That it's very likely they're going to come out of that feeling judged, not understood. Be there for them. Offer your eyes, your ears, your heart. And you can do this without pressuring them, without rushing them, without providing that sense of judgment. And, don't tell them how to feel. If they are angry at someone, if they're angry at God, allow them to be angry. It's okay to be angry. It's okay for them to feel what they feel. We can still provide a presence that is marked with compassion, with love. And that is the godly perspective that is so often needed. That last summary, I would repeat: offer your eyes, offer your ears, and offer your heart to them. Try to be present with them in the moment. These experiences can be marked by chaos, and confusion. The more we can practice being present, both for ourselves and for them, the more effective we can be. Next is the section on linking, on connecting people to the resources they need. And for this, it'll be a lot of reiteration or iteration on what I've just said. Basic needs come first. Focus on the practical ways, especially ways that they themselves can participate in the process of taking care of their own needs. Give them the information they need, and if at all possible, connect them to whatever social institutions are available to remind them that they are a little less alone in this time. So on the next page, I offer a quick summary of do's and don'ts. Many of these might seem obvious, but try to be honest. Try to respect that when people are making their own decisions, you might disagree with them in some way, shape, or form. But as I said before, supporting self-efficacy is a strength in and of itself. Make it clear to them that regardless of, perhaps they're rejecting your help right, that's okay. If they come back in the future, they can still access it. It's still here for them. Try to respect their privacy, as we noted, and behave appropriately given the context. Don't exploit the relationship with a person. Don't make false promises or exaggerate your skills or force help on people. Don't pressure them to tell you their story. If they are not ready to share, then they are not ready to share. There's no crowbar that will healthily open them up at that moment. And the very process of doing so will do more damage than good. So try through this, rather than bringing a sense of judgment, to bring an open hand so that people can feel heard and appreciated. On the next slide, we move forward to a quick set of reminders. On the next slide is about respecting culture, about respecting people's culture by being aware of your dress, of the challenges and limitations that are involved when working across language barriers, being aware of your gender, age, and power differential that you're bringing with you, so that when you do interact, you can do so in a respectful way, in a way that acknowledges that there might be differences that you feel uncomfortable with. That's okay. But in the end, we are here for them. We are, to put it another way, we are all them. And we are here to stand with people as best we can. In order to respect the people that we're interacting with, try to offer them the dignity that is so often being stripped from them in these cases. Be careful in the way that we touch, in the behaviors that could bring us in close to people's lives. And this applies too when we talk about their beliefs and their religion, their ideological stances. Take care to honor those differences. They are going to have their own ways of trying to make sense of and trying to make meaning out of this. You can be part of that story if they feel safe enough to let you in. But when stepping into that space, know that you're stepping on holy ground. And so when they let you in, try as much as you can to respect their voice in that. And this brings us to the next slide, where we talk about this deeper question that will affect both the way we interact with them, but also the way that we try to make meaning out of this. Where is God in the midst of such destruction? It's hard. It is. We recognize this, I think, when we try to give clear answers, but often we fall back into all too easy and rigid responses that diminish the meaning that this kind of destruction takes on for the survivors. So, for example, we might be inclined to think about this as some kind of fate, as something that God simply predetermined for this people and that it has no meaning beyond it. This simplistic answer can be easy to offer in cliches, at least in English, such as, well, it is what it is. It's our way of suggesting that we are just too uncomfortable to sit in the pain of having to acknowledge, I don't know. Another easy error to fall into is thinking that this must be about something that these people have done that God is punishing them for. Or perhaps that God is using this to open them up to the gospel. Now, any number of these could have an element of truth to them, or maybe not. But by leaning back on these simplistic descriptions, we miss the opportunity to be present to the other person. You know, we can recognize this pretty easily in the way we ourselves have encountered people in pain, if and when we have offered a simple answer. It's often been because we really don't feel very comfortable in the space, in the emotions, in this interaction, and we're looking for a way to make it better. But ultimately, when we do that, we're saying that we want to make it better for us because we don't dare to tread there. So when coming to this question, leave room for God to surprise you. Leave room for Him to show Himself in all kinds of small ways. Allow space in your attention to recognize Him in the love and the joy and the peace. But even ultimately, amid the suffering, we don't walk into it ready to describe where He's at. We walk into it ready to look for Him, ready to come to places of suffering, not to wipe away what it is, but to allow it to be what it is, to be more deeply honest with ourselves and others. This is a hard thing to do, though, when we are overwhelmed ourselves. And this leads to the last slide, which is about taking care of ourselves. We need to be able to manage our own emotions and our own needs, because otherwise, when we step in to these places of deep pain and suffering, it can be easy to act without realizing it, to make ourselves feel better, rather than to serve the people we're there for. So, this is a much bigger topic, and one that I'm glad to hand on to my fellow counselor, Corinne, who will walk through this and a handful of other topics in more detail. Thank you.
Yes. So it's definitely important that the better adults, caregivers, and children and teenagers' lives are doing, that it's going to reflect on how the children are doing as well. So what may we see for children physically? Their speech could be affected. There may be loss of appetites, just their bodies are full of aches. Some develop even hive asthma. So if you see that in children, or you hear of people talking about that their children just seem to be different, this could be helpful for them to know. It's like, hey, that's actually a normal reaction to a very abnormal situation. Children tend to be more fearful or angry and aggressive, or fluctuating between different states. They may also feel responsible for some of what happened, maybe that they weren't able to help another sibling or their parents. So watch out for that. They're losing interest in life. A lot of these children, I don't know when they could be able to go back to school, but they may really be struggling and don't have an interest in learning because their needs are so much greater. And they take so much energy just to cope with this. Regressing behavior, kind of falling back to an earlier developmental stage, is likely to happen, that there is thumb sucking or their speech has changed, as I said before. They may be wetting a bed again. Even for kids that are in their preteens, that's possible. Maybe crying a lot or upset, difficulty to concentrate. Maybe their play has significantly changed and there's a lot of aggressive play, or play of being trapped. That's a way to actually helping them with it. Like, oh, this is happening. How can you get out of this? Or if this figure here is trapped, how could we help them get out? Teenagers, they tend to withdraw more or prefer to spend time with their peers and not so much with adults. There also may be more risky behavior, like doing things that puts them or their health in danger. So what helps children? To be reunited with family or caregiver, people that are safe for them as soon as possible. Reestablishing a routine. So whatever they've known before can help. In those areas where they've lost everything, like their house, their toys, family members, friends, their school, where there's like nothing left, there seems to be like, what are they returning to? How can we help them? Whatever, even if it's a small thing that's familiar to them, where like you've been eating, your families have been eating together before, or food can be a source of comfort, food that they know, games they've played. That leads me also to the next one, leave room to play. If you're volunteering somewhere, maybe it's just setting up football games or some other tag games, getting them to play, bringing toys along. Play is a healing thing for children. It helps them to sort through what they experienced. Establishing any familiarity is helpful. It's important that children are sheltered and protected from like the ongoing news, because that can just increase their anxiety of hearing more and more and more. So not letting them be in the room or the TV go all the time, or like news coming over and over. They need kind of breaks. Helping children to express what they are feeling, are they thinking, through words, through art, drawing, with toys. That's a good way. It's important not to compare them to siblings or other peers of like, oh, he's not crying as much as you do. Your sibling is so much stronger than you are. That is not helpful at all. And affirm that you are a big person in their life, that you're going to take care of them. And if you're struggling, or if you see parents of children struggling, like, yeah, support them, as Nick said before, like come alongside caregivers. And as I said before, the better and the more stable the big people in children's life are, the more stabilizing this will be to children as well. Yeah. For teenagers, a lot of it the same, especially needed, give them time to talk and to share. And don't push it if they don't want to. They also need room for interaction with their peers. They need to know it's okay to be sad and to cry. And teenagers, as they're in a way of becoming young adults, as Nick said before, the sense of I can do something, allow them to be part of any helping process, something that they can be responsible for and that's manageable. That's not overpowering or overwhelming them. But when they can be part of a solution, they're going to do better. So in this next part, I want to talk more about self-care, both for response workers, and a lot of them, what I'm going to share here also does apply to actually survivors of the disaster themselves. But as you come alongside these people, and this is going to be for the long haul, this is going to be for months and years. And so self-care is not something that's selfish. In these times, it seems like, well, but that's not important. Like the priority is to help, to get people stabilized. Yes. And there is a part of take care of yourself, because then you're going to be a good steward of what God has given you. Like the energy, the wisdom, your health. And the better you steward that, the longer you can care for people. So here's just a list of things that are generally helpful. And one of them, and it's on the top of it, is rest. Like sleep as a responder, as somebody that's caregiving or being involved with just the endless needs of people, you need a rest too, because that's going to help you being more balanced, being less triggered, being less irritated or overwhelmed. Reducing alcohol and caffeine is helpful because that's actually increasing the kind of sleep we have. I'm very aware that caffeine is a very big thing. Tea is everywhere in Turkey. That's what a lot of people drink. So that may be like coming up against a very big, well, no, we're going to drink tea. So by putting it out there, maybe there's like drink some other tea in the evening, encouraging people because they'll be able to rest better and their body will do better. Exercise, walk, encourage people to go out. Maybe if there's like people in your neighborhood that have been resettled there and you make connection, like invite them on walks. Run if you can't go out, if you're in areas where the whole infrastructure is just broken and you can't just go out, nature isn't accessible anymore. There's workout videos, move your body because it's moving stress out. It's releasing tension and you'll feel better. You'll come back more refreshed. It may be needed to reduce the time spent on news or social media of constantly hearing the toll numbers, all the problems, or maybe reducing sitting with people in the neighborhood that are just continually talking about it. And you know, it's like, it's actually increasing my anxiety. Take a break from it. Check the news twice a day for 10 minutes each. You probably get most of it in like 24/7. Like with children, reestablishing routines is very important. Debrief together as caregivers, as responders. Steve referred to the group. If you're part of a group, you're going to do better. You may need to talk about it because you've seen a lot, you heard a lot, and that does do something. We are people. We're not machines. So we are responding and reacting to what's around us. So I really encourage you to, with one-on-one or in small groups with trusted people, share how you've been affected. Not necessarily share all the stories that you've heard, but like how it's affected you. Drawing or writing about how you feel can really be helpful. On our website, under the resources, we have a video of that's walking you through, draw out your emotion. It's quick, like 10 minutes, really helpful, can get like something moving inside. Having fun, plan fun activities. May sound like, well, there's nothing, like why fun? Like this is so huge. Well, fun helps us to recharge. So if you're a team leader or responsible for people, for their schedule as they help and clean up or whatever they do, schedule in fun and rest time. Maybe bring a ball with you and find, play a place where you can play ball or some other games. Like laughter is medicine. And for us believers, praying, journaling, and lamenting is a powerful way of caring for ourselves and in the long run for others. So lamenting means turning to God. It means bringing the complaint to him, like with blunt language. Write out your laments, read Psalms of lament, use other people's words that have gone through hard things. After complaining in a lament, it means asking boldly, what do you want and need from God? And then it's the end of a lament is choosing to trust God, like that he can be trusted, that he's worthy, and committing yourself to praising him, even if it's really, really, really hard. That starts changing something in us towards the better. I want to give you 2 practical exercises that you can do for yourself, but also teach to others. And when we post all of these in the resources, you'll get the script for both the deep breathing and the butterfly hug that I'm going to briefly take you through. So why deep breathing and why that's important? For one, it's so easy and it's for free. You can do it at any time. And it really helps the body. So our body has an automatic nervous system that controls our breathing, that controls our heart rate, our digestion. And the sympathetic nervous system is the part that activates us to go to fight, flight. So with stress, that one is higher. The parasympathetic nervous system allows us to calm down and to relax. So if we practice and engage in one of them, the other one weakens. So by doing some deep breathing, we are strengthening the relaxation in the body. So I would invite you to just follow along. This is going to be really short, but sit in a comfortable place with your back straight. And then place your tongue against the back of your top teeth and keep it there. And exhale completely through your mouth, around your tongue, and making even a swoosh sound like. And close your lips and inhale through your nose on a count of 4. 2, 3, 4. Hold your breath for a count of 7. 2, 3, 4, 5, 7. And exhale completely through your mouth, making that swoosh sound on a count of 8. So we'll do it together. Breathe in on 4. Breathe out. Breathe in. Breathe out. Breathe in. Breathe out. All right. And in the beginning, as you're learning this, keep it to 4 cycles. The in and the out is 1 cycle, 4. And as you practice more, you can go up to 8. The reason we don't do more because it can lead to lightheadedness at first, but with more practice, that reduces. So this is something that everybody can do. Children can do that. Adults can do that. You can teach that to others, and it helps to relax the body. And it can be done so many times throughout the day as needed, but do it at least twice. Then the next exercise is the butterfly hug. And for that, as you see in a picture, you cross your arms in front of you and rest your thumbs at the beginning of your collarbone. And it's gently tapping, slowly and gently tapping your hands. Like 10 times. If it feels good, tap longer. This can be combined with thinking of a safe place, of a place where you feel calm and relaxed. That may be an actual place or a place people, can imagine. I think if you work with survivors of the earthquakes, them thinking of their home is not the best because that's not there anymore. So maybe it's more like a place somewhere else or out in nature. Often it's in the woods or by the sea or with family member. They can picture that, and as they picture that, gently tap. And then take a deep breath. So those are 2 ways. And then there's just one more. It's called the container exercise. There's times when you may feel overwhelmed or you encounter people that just feel overwhelmed with what they've experienced and their emotions or their thoughts. They have intrusive thoughts are just so high that it feels like they can't cope with it. So this is a temporary relief of like in the moment where you're responding to somebody and you can't fall apart or you can't take time out right then and there. It's like this mental image. So you may want to close your eyes or look down at the ground. I'll invite you to join in. Close your eyes or look down on the ground. And then you imagine a box or a container that's strong and sturdy and just really, really as big as you need it to be. And it's open right now. And now you place anything that's disturbing you in there. Big and small things. Thoughts, sensations in your body, uncomfortable emotions, whatever is disturbing to you now. You place it in a box. And then you close the box. And you take the key or a padlock or however you can lock this box up and you lock it. And you keep the key and put it in a safe place. Don't throw it away. You can't throw away the key, but you put it in a safe place. And so at a later point, when you have time to breathe, are alone or are with somebody that you trust, open that box up and process what's in there. So this container exercise is a temporary relief and putting it away, but always with the goal that you will come back to. Because if we just put it away and put it away and put it away over weeks and months and years, it's still going to be active and it's going to come out in some other ways. All right, we have come to the end of our presentation, and with the interruption, took us a little bit more time, but we still want to give time to a few questions. So, okay, let me quickly open this up. All right. So there is a question on respecting the culture. Okay, I'm realizing now that some of those questions, they came in as, the recording stopped or the slides stopped on my laptop. I apologize for that. So if you have any questions, please type it in the chat and we'll get back to you. Yeah, and send them to Nick. Maybe I need to say that.
Yes.
Yes, send them to Nick, not to me, since my computer is non-functional. Well, I don't see any. Oh, okay. Question is, why are people who have experienced trauma more accident prone? So, Steve, do you want to respond to that?
Sure. I think the answer to that question is we're not sure. We just know it's true. So, and I'm sorry, I think I lost my view here, so I don't know if you guys can see me. So one of the things that seems to be the case is that most psychological problems involve a loss of attention and concentration. So anxiety, depression, PTSD, all disrupt concentration. And so when we're not concentrating and focusing well, we're more likely to have accidents. But honestly, that's more theory-based. And I don't think we have a good, solid, more detailed answer than that.
So there's a question. Oh, are you done? You okay, Steve?
Yeah, did you hear me okay? I just want to
Yes.
make sure.
Yes, yeah, we heard you. One of the questions about tips or suggestions for facilitating group debriefings. I think one of the things that is important, if you do it, that you've done it before and you're not doing it alone, and have people that have a similar experience in it. So not responders and survivors in the same group. One of the models that is used is the critical incident management tool. There is some discussion, is it really, really helpful or not? But I think what is helpful is giving people space to talk and to express themselves. In terms of doing it with nationals, with Turks, there's material that's being developed, but we don't know yet when it's coming out. And that's specifically how churches can facilitate safe groups for people, to talk. So I hope that, but yeah, that's like still in the process of making, maybe it's going to speed up with the big need that there is there. Yes, so that would be a longer, like there can be a much longer answer to that. I hope that answers this a little bit. We have got a question. Yeah.
Can I just add one more thing? With the critical incidents just debriefing and management, I was trained in that and used that for several years. Unfortunately, what the research showed is if it's a higher intensity trauma, that's not a helpful format. So for very mild exposure to trauma, that format seems to work pretty well. And so what happened is that, the whole mental health community endorsed it because there was some promising results early on, but over time, those results showed actually there can be some negative effects, especially for people who had more severe exposure to trauma.
Thank you, Steve. Another question came in that we wanted to address. It asked, how do we prevent or how do we manage a tendency some of us have to over-identify with survivors, where we might find ourselves getting lost in or stuck in their experience to the point where we ourselves are experiencing it in turn. This is one of many symptoms of compassion fatigue. And I would really encourage you at times like this to practice, first off, to find someone you can talk to about it, who can help you to remain within your own experience rather than in someone else. You can use mindfulness practices. We had a webinar about that the other week, where we kind of give a sense of what that can look like. But for this purpose, I would say it can be really valuable to spend some time just drawing your attention to your own experience. And since our thoughts and our emotions can sometimes run away from us, it can be helpful to draw attention back to our embodied experience, our sensations, to sit with your five senses, to sit with what you're experiencing in your body, and just to be there for a time. This can help you be more present to yourself, so you don't find yourself as overwhelmed or stuck in the survivor's experience itself.
And maybe I'll just add, Nick, that, you know, we sometimes describe what Nick is talking about as grounding. And just think of it simply as anything that can turn your attention to your outward experience when you're feeling overwhelmed internally. You know, so what we mean by that is when Nick's talking about, like, you know, your five senses. What am I seeing? What am I hearing? What am I touching? What am I feeling? What am I even smelling or tasting? And those things can be really helpful at that moment when you're just kind of overwhelmed, to get you back into the present and get you out of that kind of overwhelmed state.
Yeah. Some questions came in asking how we could talk about our faith or pray with people in an appropriate, respectful, kind way. These are the best way we can do this is just to remember that we're talking for ourselves. We're sharing our experience. If people want to learn about our faith, that's great, but don't push farther than that. And often they might ask a question like, so why are you doing this? And you can be very honest and tell them, well, because I believe in Jesus Christ, because of what he's done for me, and let it go at that. If they continue on, then absolutely go with them where they'll go. But you don't have to open that up yourself. Similarly, praying with people, showing up, being there for them is an excellent way to go. I will turn it over to Corinne for a question about how we can explain natural disasters to little kids without inducing or causing panic or distress.
Yes, generally give children as much information as they need and really age appropriate. So big things happen and big things are out of our control, but now mom and dad or whoever is their big person, we're going to do our very best to keep you safe. And with children, they fill in, they have great sensors, they take a lot of things in, but they may not be great at interpreting it in a correct way. So really following up with them, or like, so how did you understand that? Like, what do you think? Keep the conversation going. I think we can say, hey, this is really, really big and it's scary, but you are safe right now. I think that is like right now you are safe, and mommy and daddy, your parents are doing their best to keep you safe right now. Do we have to guarantee that nothing is going to happen? No, we don't. And that's hard. And you don't need to lie to them. But it's like we are doing the best we can. And big things happen, but they don't all happen all the time.
There's a question off this
Okay. With the you are being safe right now, or I'm being safe right now, somebody asked, so what does the butterfly hug help? So it is something that is used in a trauma treating approach. It uses bilateral by tapping left and right. It uses two-sided stimulation, and that helps the brain to process things, to interact, for the two brain sides to interact better. And it's also a calming effect. And there's like nerves going through here. So that can calm, plus a hug gives a sense of safety and closeness. And we keep getting questions in. We're unfortunately not going to get to all of them. But keep sending them and we'll try to save them and respond. And if there's like statements to some of them we can give later, we'll do. But there was one, how do we know if people need more treatment, need to speak to a licensed counselor, or if like somebody being 3 months postpartum need to speak to a counselor? So I think with what has been said before, the initial reaction is there for most people. If you continue to find yourself or see somebody 6 months later still struggling a lot, then that's a sign for talking to a counselor. I think for somebody being postpartum, where your infant is close to you a lot, deep breathing, like calming yourself as much as you can, is helpful in helping the child and yourself. But if you feel like it really interrupts the flow of like how you parent, or you feel like I'm not a good parent, it could be helpful to talk to somebody. Yeah.
Maybe I could just, there was a question about how long volunteers should be on the ground. And let me just mention that the unfortunate part is it really depends on the amount of training the volunteers have. So highly trained volunteers can stay on the ground much longer than people who are just kind of off the street saying, I'm concerned and I want to be there and I want to help. And also it also depends on the intensity of the environment they're in. So I can't give you a specific amount of time, but I'd say more highly trained volunteers who are can tolerate, because they're more highly trained and they kind of know what to do in that situation. Like they know how to put up tents, they know how to get access to water, and they know how to treat people. For instance, those people can stay much longer. For untrained volunteers, you want to be really cautious about overextending your stay if the environment is very intense. So depending, for instance, you have to think about things like, what sort of services do you have available for the volunteers? Do they have adequate water? Do they have adequate food? Do they have adequate shelter? They can tolerate it for longer if they have all those things. And also, what's the intensity of their work? So if they're doing highly intense work, then they'll need to not be as long. If they're doing less intense work, they can stay longer. So I wish I could give you one direct answer, but I think it depends on a lot of factors.
We'll let Nick take one more question, and then we'll have to stop here. We'll let you go. Yes.
Yes, there were a number of questions where people were asking about trauma and its relationship to grief. When this happens, even within the professional literature, it's referred to as complicated, because it is. And this often happens in cases of natural and human initiated disasters. The shock itself is often present, especially early on, but it can become complicated by the various loss of loved ones and of people we care about. These exacerbate each other. And in fact, then the trauma reminders from the PTSD can actually make it more difficult to know how to grieve, because you don't want to, even come close to it. During these times, I would definitely recommend finding, if at all possible, some professional services who can help work through this. In the meantime, I think my best recommendation for those in families who are experiencing both of these things at the same time is to be patient and to be kind. When you notice these symptoms coming up, try to make sure that it's not something, an object of derision or frustration, that you recognize this is our loved ones doing the very best they can to work through what is a tremendous, tremendous tragedy, both personally and communally. Give them the time and the space to do so. I'll often say one of the best ways we can respond is being aware of what this is doing in our heart, being aware of our bodies and the effect that it's having on us and that we're carrying. So part of the practice of being compassionate is learning also how to be self-compassionate, how to be ready to turn towards ourselves with a sense of kindness, to recognize that we are all in this together and that we can help hold each other and take care of each other as we heal. As Corinne was saying, we are deeply grateful for your many excellent questions and your interest in this subject. Clearly, it's something that has affected, that is affecting, and will continue to affect many of us. And we are all on the lookout for ways that we can help support people on the ground and those at a distance who are trying to work through this best we can. We thank you all for your kind interest, and we will try to put as much of this information and more onto our website so we can make this information accessible to all. We want to provide you with the best that we have to offer. In the meantime, God bless. Thank you very much.